So hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us today for Peer Review 101. My name is Amy Freeman. I'm the Scholarly Communication Librarian at USC Columbia, and I am here on behalf of both the Continuing Education Committee and the South Carolina Libraries Journal. So I'm happy to be moderating what I am sure is going to be a very informative and lively discussion on peer review in academic journals. So we're going to start out with a panel discussion, and then we are going to briefly hear from Edward Blessing, who is the peer review editor of South Carolina Libraries. If you have questions, feel free to pop them into the chat at any time, because we are going to leave plenty of time for those questions. So let me introduce you to our two panelists before we get started. Joining us today, we have Brent Appling and Anna Dubnakovic. Brent has worked for USC's Thomas Cooper Library since 2011, first as a research and instruction librarian, and he is now the collection assessment librarian. Brent is the co-founder of South Carolina Libraries and served as the editor of the journal from its inception in 2013 until 2018. Anna is the head of the music library here at USC as well. She also serves as the editor-in-chief for the Taylor and Francis journal Music Reference Services Quarterly, and she is a peer reviewer for the Journal of Academic Libraries and for iLibri. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, Anna and Brent, are you ready to go? And can you still, oops, I think I lost my screen.
Ready?
Yes.
Okay, hopefully screen is back now. Oh, I apologize. Hang tight.
There we go.
There we go. All right. Let's see. Now, feel free to jump in, whoever wants to go first. But if you want to build off of each other or answer independently, that is totally fine. So the first question that we're going to talk about today is, why do you personally choose to act as a peer reviewer? Why is offering peer review something that is important, even though it might not provide you with any direct benefit?
Well, Anna and I's experiences are probably a good bit different. I wouldn't mind if Anna kind of fielded this first, and I could just kind of build from there.
Sure. I think actually our experiences are probably more similar than you think, Brent.
Okay.
So as for direct benefit, I think we actually do get a direct benefit if you think of it in terms of, that directly affecting our jobs, because we both work in an academic library. And so one of our duties is actually scholarly, I'm not sure how they put it, a service to the profession. And so this definitely falls under that. Although I doubt that, and I'm sure Brent will agree, anybody would do this just to fulfill a requirement, because there are definitely easier ways to do this, because peer reviewing is definitely something that's involved and it takes a lot of your time. And so personally, the reason I do it is because, well, it's a little bit selfish, I have to admit, because I like to be the first one to hear about new studies, new ideas that are floating out there. But in recent years, it's also because I realize how difficult it is to put yourself out there and to consider publishing, and how deeply personal, that rejection, in case it comes, might be. And so I know that we think of peer reviewing as sort of this critical activity, which it definitely is, but it can also be a mentoring experience if you approach it right. And so for me, especially in the recent years, as I've gained a little bit more experience in my career, it's also been about helping colleagues that are perhaps a little bit earlier in their career to get their publishing feet a little bit more established, and to sort of, have a little bit more confidence, and to look at this as something that could even maybe be enjoyable.
Awesome. I think you've nailed it, especially as far as getting benefit out of it. I think there is direct benefit. You gain experience in learning about your field, and I think that sometimes can be a little selfish, as Anna has said, meaning that you can kind of be on the forefront of looking at this material. For me, though, it was a little bit different. Like the idea of choosing to act as a peer reviewer for me at first was out of necessity with trying to get the South Carolina Libraries Journal off the ground and not getting a ton of people saying, hey, yeah, I want to be a peer reviewer. So I did have to serve as one myself. But ideally, as an editor of a journal, you would want to detach yourself from that process the best you could. But obviously, that didn't always happen. But for even beyond, since I've stepped down as editor, this last issue, I was more than happy to serve as a peer reviewer, not only because I knew how hard it can be to get people to do that, especially when trying to restart an endeavor and you're kind of trying to get the ball rolling again. I definitely decided to work on that. And I really like how Anna had pointed out that overall this is a service to your profession and field. And the reason it's important is because it's a process that allows peers in the field to examine the work of other peers and raise questions about aspects of the work that may need greater clarity. Peer reviews offer an unbiased view upheld by that double-blind aspect of the process, and helps with highlighting when certain claims can't be drawn from a certain piece of work, especially given the scope of the study, design, and methodology. All of those things are important to the field and the profession to make sure that there's this level of, I hate to use the phrase gatekeeping, but that kind of is what it is. This trying to make sure there is a consistent level of what's the word I'm looking for? Reliability. And so I think it does provide benefit, perhaps indirect benefit at a certain level, by holding the profession to a certain standard.
Yeah, that's great. Those are really important insights. So once you have decided that you do think that offering peer reviews are important, this is something that you want to do, and you want to get started, what would you say should be included in the actual peer review itself? And what do you think the best format is for providing that sort of feedback?
I could jump in on this first, Anna, if you don't mind.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
And again, your experience might be way different, so I'm interested to hear what you say too. But for me, when I first started working on this journal and kind of researching how best to provide peer review guidelines, I pretty much found out there aren't any actual hard and fast rules for this. It's often, well, it's almost always very discipline specific, and in many cases can be journal specific, which is actually kind of good for a publication like South Carolina Libraries, because it means we can sort of make what we think is the most reasonable rules there. And so for me, and I've iterated this a good bit when trying to recruit peer reviewers, because often the first question will be, well, how do I do it? What do I look for? All that kind of nuts and bolts stuff. And for me, the goal of peer review is to help verify that any methods of research used adhere to successful practices of the profession. So the thing about librarianship is we're usually practitioners first, researchers second if we're lucky, and then there's those that really wear both hats all the time. And so trying to get people to look at it from that practitioner perspective first, I think, is an important kind of first step. And so we're really just trying to make sure that those practices of the profession and any data collected was done so in a verifiable way, and also to look out for any irrelevant findings, unwarranted claims, poor or unacceptable interpretations, and any personal views. So those are sort of the things that I recommend people look out for. As far as format goes, when doing these peer reviews, for me in the past, any effective way to communicate the findings of the review is really what you want to strive for. And this can really be done in any format. I've received peer reviews simply in an email that I then compile. But I've also certainly received fully formed documents and sometimes I'll just get a manuscript that has comments written throughout it. Ideally, I'd probably like to see something that's a little bit more of a combination of those second two things. So what I prefer is to get first a summary of the review, usually a paragraph, maybe a little more depending on how dense the piece is. And that summary will tell me what's been done well, what needs work, and if necessary, some pretty broad suggestions on how the work can be strengthened. This would also be a good place for the reviewer to make a pretty clear-cut decision on whether they think that article is acceptable for a peer-reviewed publication. For South Carolina Libraries being meant to be a vehicle for all types of librarians, many aren't going to have the experience or the research know-how to do what might be a conventional scientific research article where you have a methodology, where you do a literature review, where you have a discussion section and conclusion. And in that case, I've been flexible in trying to encourage pretty much anything to be submitted. And then if it looks like it can be worked into a pretty good research paper, if there is space for a nice literature review or some type of meta-analysis, then we might suggest how to move forward on that to make it into a peer-reviewed article. Some do come in already having all that, which is great. Peer review, just make some changes and then go from there. But we also open it up a little bit to where if we get a submission that doesn't look like it's going to really fit the muster of a peer-reviewed journal article, well, then we have this other article format that we call feature articles, which is really just, it could be the end game of a research project, but just wasn't really displayed in a scholarly format, if that makes sense. And then we can sort of suggest a way to make it a little bit, if needed, a little bit less research-based and more just communication of this is what we did and this is what worked, that kind of stuff. So there are lots of ways that I've tried to work with authors, and that's basically because of the nature of this particular publication. Some publications will not accept anything but research articles, and I understand that. So going back to the format, in addition to that summary, then I would also want to see specific comments and suggestions from the reviewer included within the original manuscript. That's really what helps the editors the most, because that way, when we get those peer reviews from hopefully 3, maybe 2, if that's all we can get, then those editors can then compile all of those comments, compile the summaries together, and maybe hopefully give some sort of here are the suggestions throughout. Oftentimes, those suggestions might just be simple edits. Others will be like, this is a big claim that really needs a citation. I think you should start looking in the literature for a little bit more to help you out here. So those types of suggestions are really what help the editors be able to compile something to then send off to the authors, and then the authors can make those revisions and resubmit.
Thanks, Brent. Anna, what are your thoughts?
So that's a very good question. And my answer is, and I will just flat out admit it, is just based on my experience with the 2 publishers, Elsevier and the Gruyter Sauer. So just based on that, I don't really think that there's a definitive format for a peer review, but there's definitely some essential elements to it without doubt. And so for me, it's important to include both your critique and, but also to kind of think about what is it that's well done in the study, and to also make sure that you include some of that for the author too. And so for these areas that need improvement, also it's important to include as much details about your reasoning. So why do you think that these things need to be improved? And I think that's what Brent said as well. And so that guidance is essential, because if you don't provide that, then you've left the author with, these vague statements that are not really particularly useful to them, and will probably get caught by the editor, before they even send this review to the author. And some journals will also have definitive ways that they like you to go about peer review, as Brent has mentioned for his journal. And so on occasion, I've received a form that looks kind of like a grading rubric and has definite questions that you need to answer. But others have been more relaxed, and they pretty much left you to your own devices and, just basically gave you the article and you're supposed to provide your honest assessment. So some of this might be out of your hands, but the one thing that all of this has in common, and the crux of it, is that your assessment is always going to be required.
Thanks, Anna. Well, building off of that question a little bit, if you have reviewed an item or if you're in the process of reviewing a work and you have decided that you don't think that it should be published, or if you think that the manuscript needs major work before it's accepted, how would you provide that sort of sensitive feedback to the authors?
Well, I'll just say real quick, delicately but decisively is how I've done it in the past. And if you can specifically explain the article's deficiencies, relating them to specific notes from the reviewers as appropriate, that's probably the best first step. And I have more to say on this, but I'd like to hear what Anna is thinking about this as well.
So I don't know, but to me, this is a much more difficult task in my editor role than my reviewer role. And the reason is simple, because as a reviewer, I only make recommendations, but it's up to the editor to pull the plug, so to speak. So that aside, I agree with Brent. I think we should always remember that no matter how difficult or even demoralizing it might be to have your paper rejected, at least if the content's not up to par, it would be potentially embarrassing to have this paper out there and attached to your name and out there forever. So I guess if you're an author, you can think of it this way, as sort of a service to you. But the key there is to, as Brent said, delicately, sort of offer constructive criticism and suggestions on how the author can improve this paper, because I haven't really seen anything so far, and I've been doing this for about 10 years as an editor, that absolutely can't be improved. Now, some things, and this is what Brent has mentioned, I think, in the first question, that some papers are just not meant to be research studies, but even those, if they have something substantive to say, can be published as non-peer-reviewed publications. And I think that's where, especially beginning writers, they're not aware of those opportunities. So as much as possible, I always try to include other places where they can send their papers so that they can be published if they absolutely can't be remade into some sort of a research study that is better published as a peer-reviewed publication.
I think that's right. I think you want to do your best to avoid discouraging this author from trying to communicate what it is that they think is important. The authors have submitted something because they think that it's necessary and useful. And if you can, even if it, at the point of submission, you see it as being unpublishable, I think Anna's right. There's very few times where you're just like, this will never be publishable. In fact, I've never given that feedback ever. And I have had to deny some people some articles into the actual journal, but always with the intention of saying, okay, here's what me as editor and what these anonymous peer reviewers have suggested ways of making this better. Rewrite it. Maybe if there needs to be a little bit more done in the methodology area, take some more time and come back with it. Hopefully those authors are in places where they can commit more time to it and be able to come back with it. So the main thing is, like, don't feel like you're looking at an article to be punitive, even if it is right off the bat pretty obviously outside of what you would normally consider a publishable article. Try to figure out ways to communicate that there is something to this article, but here's some ways to make it even better. And I really liked what Anna said about this process being a service to the authors, and that if you aren't going to do the due diligence of reviewing an article and just throw it out there, and then suddenly you have a really junky article out there and your name is attached to it, the publication is attached to it. I've ran across more than a couple that were published in what I would consider pretty good librarianship research journals that have been pretty junky, and I've often wondered how stringent that peer review process actually was. So I really agree with what Anna was saying here, and basically trying to avoid discouragement from continuing that article submission, especially with a publication that I was editing, and was sort of one of the main topics here, which is South Carolina libraries. If you're discouraged, if the word gets out that you're not accepting many things and that you're constantly saying this isn't up to snuff for a research article, then you're going to stop getting submissions too, which is obviously not what you want.
Great, thank you. This next question is a little bit of a two-part question, and I paired them because I think they're pretty complementary, but feel free to either tackle them together or separately. So the questions are, what are your overall best tips for writing peer reviewers and for writing peer reviews? And along with that, how should someone who is interested in writing peer reviews but hasn't been very involved before actually get started with that process?
Do you want me to take that, Brent, or do you want to go first?
I can go first. I can start with the first part. My biggest tip here is to first, when you get assigned to peer reviewing an article, the first thing I would recommend doing is read the whole article first. In that first run through, try to avoid immediate reactions and suggestions right off the bat. You know, the whole not being able to see the forest for the trees thing. Try to see the big picture. I get stuck on that a lot, especially in editing, where you start reading it in your first paragraph, you're like, this isn't what I would have done, this is what I would have done. And then by the second or third page, you're like, oh, this is what they're trying to do. So I would do a quick run through of the article, even if you're ultimately kind of skimming it. Go through it once, and then on the second go through, that's when you want to start going with an eye for editing and suggesting. Definitely note things along the way. I mean, it's hard to read something without having some thoughts and reactions. So, you know, don't avoid any of that altogether, just maybe not start throwing those suggestions in right away. But the second time, definitely start thinking about that. Go through what you see as claims. Are they backed up by a citation or observational findings or experimental findings? If not, is this a place for that? That would be a good place to start throwing those suggestions in. And as you go, make comments within the manuscript that might point out deficiencies, but also try to make comments that suggest and encourage ways to improve those deficiencies. And as we've mentioned before, be as constructive as possible through that. And then Anna, if you want to have anything to add to that, or if you want to just jump into that second question, that would be cool.
Sure. Well, basically, I don't have much to say beyond and this may sound very obvious, but don't accept reviewing something that's out of your area of expertise. And this may sound like a no-brainer, but in librarianship, you know, we're all sort of in this profession where the knee-jerk reaction is to say yes, you know, and to try to do our best. But if you, trust me, if you accept something that's out of your area of expertise, you're really not doing a favor to anyone, because, you know, you're not going to be able to offer constructive feedback if you don't understand the topic. And we all know that librarianship is a very nebulous profession and can all take many different roles and directions. And so even if you I know that a lot of us accept these assignments just by reading the abstract. So even if it so happens that from the abstract it looks like it's something that falls into your area and you accept it, it's not rude or bad to just go and write to the editor and say, hey, upon closer reading, it looks like this is not something that I feel comfortable reviewing. So, here are the areas where I am strong in, and, if other papers that more closely match my qualifications are available, I'll be happy to review them. Just in my role as an editor, I'd much rather receive that than, a review that is maybe not, doesn't make sense or is not going to do the author much good. If you think about yourself as an author, kind of submitting a paper, I'm sure that you would agree that you'd rather somebody who knows your field reviewed it. And if you've been in this situation where, as an author, you receive feedback and it makes no sense, then, you can 99 times out of 100, kind of suspect that this is exactly what happened. Somebody who didn't really understand your paper was assigned to review it and they accepted. And the other thing that's maybe equally important is to adhere to the deadlines. And the simple reason for that is that while every journal that I reviewed for, and certainly my own journal, we all have production deadlines, which are pretty tight. And maybe if I'm lacking a paper, I can push that deadline by a week, but not much more than that. And there's definite page counts that need to be met. And so if you don't have that, that is not good, especially if you don't have papers in a backlog. And so if you don't submit that review, that shortens on time, then that shortens that time that the author would have to look at your suggestions and revise the paper and then submit it for consideration to the editor, because it could so happen that the paper needs a second round of review, which adds some additional time. So just be kind of mindful of this. If the editor has given you a deadline, there's probably a reason for it. It could be that they are thinking that paper might go into a special topic issue that they're planning, or who knows what. But if you can't meet that deadline, a better thing to do is either to refuse or to say, okay, can I have another couple of weeks? And so if they come back and say, yeah, sure, no problem, take another couple of weeks, then that means probably, it's flexible and they have some papers in the backlog, but never assume that they do. It's just a courteous thing to do. And so, what was the second part?
Yeah, so if you want to get started writing, what would your first step be?
Okay. So for that part, I think if you're looking for opportunities, there's definitely listservs and such, and I won't mention any because, I don't even know who the audience is. So if you're an academic librarian, you might have different preferences for listserv than if you're, a public librarian or government librarian or what have you. But that's definitely a good place to start. Also, if you have a journal that you like, that you regularly read, you should just write to the editor-in-chief and say, hey, these are my areas of expertise and I enjoy reading your journal and I follow it. And so, if you would like me to become a reviewer, I would be more than happy to. Also, if you are an author and your paper gets accepted, then, if you like the journal, you also can write to the editor and say, hey, thank you for, accepting my paper. I really enjoyed my experience. If you need more reviewers, I'm always happy to jump in, or something like that. So as far as the rest, and this goes back to the other question, details of peer review, and I'll stop at that. But the requirements will kind of vary widely. So, if they don't provide you with enough guidance, just feel comfortable to ask questions, because it's really a jungle out there. So some journals might expect you to even correct grammar and to, look at the writing style, whereas others will only want you to focus on the substantive argument. So rather than waste your time on style and on grammar, if they have staff who deals with those issues, then, you'll be just wasting your time. So if they haven't provided you with enough guidance, I would always feel comfortable to ask questions.
Absolutely. That was the only other thing I was going to add, was not to hesitate to ask the editors questions. And you touched on one other thing too that I think is important, the idea of reaching out to a publication that you read regularly. If you aren't reading certain publications regularly, that's what I would suggest doing, especially if you're interested in being a peer reviewer, is finding some 2 or 3 journals to follow, or even just finding articles that help you do your job within your field. And that would help you recognize what's expected from a peer-reviewed research article, and would give you a good idea, because presumably the article will have gone through the peer review process and would have passed it, and therefore would have made it through and would be representative of what those peer reviewers were looking for. So the better that you're able to recognize that, I think, would be helpful in figuring out what is sort of expected on your end as a peer reviewer.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you so much, Anna and Brent. And in just a minute, we'll have some time for everybody to ask additional questions. But speaking of those peer review editors, I am actually going to turn this over to Edward Blessing, who is the peer review editor here at South Carolina Libraries. And he's going to talk to you a little bit about the peer review process at SC Libraries. Edward?
Sure, thank you. So hopefully my camera's working. I just wanted to put a face with the name. I don't really want to take up too much bandwidth, but just hello, everyone. I'm Edward, peer review editor. With that, I'm going to turn my camera off just to save bandwidth. Thank you for your interest in the peer review process for our journal. We have about 20 peer reviewers right now signed up, and we can always use more. So if you are in this webinar and you're not signed up with SC Libraries as a peer reviewer, please do email me, as Amy has said. So peer review, just my thoughts on it, it's this quality control check for papers, and it can become a seal of approval. Or, as Brent and Anna have talked about, it can help authors craft a more well-rounded and more thought out and just a better paper. So it's a little bit gatekeeping, it's a little bit sort of seal of approval. And really, as the peer review editor, it's my process to facilitate, it's my role to facilitate this process by mainly trying to match article topics with the reviewer's area of expertise. And this is something that both, again, Anna and Brent have talked about. So it's important for me to know, if you're one of our reviewers, to know what your area of expertise is. So generally, we have tried to ask people to provide that information. We have that information for most of you, but if you're one of our reviewers and I ever ask you to review a paper that you just know you're not qualified to review it, then just don't hesitate to let me know. Just decline the review, or if you get into the paper and you realize I don't know what's going on here, just send me an email, and that's fine, and I'll assign it to someone else. We definitely don't want people to feel like they have to do a review on something they're not qualified for, or if you just don't have the time, as was brought up, just let me know. It's fine. We'll find someone else to step in there. It's important to recognize that this is a two-way process. You're giving us this your time and energy, and we're providing this line for you on your CV or your resume as this line of service, as Brent talked about. So it's definitely this relationship that we have. I want to keep it a very positive relationship between any reviewers and the journal, and I want you to know that we really do appreciate the time. And so anytime you want to, you can send me an updated synopsis of your area of expertise. And I will say that there's sort of a slight caveat, and I'll just point this out, that when we do have the sort of heavy journal article, the heavy peer review article where I'm trying to get three good reviewers in, I do try and want to get at least one peer review from someone who would have a slightly different take. So if it's an academic library paper, but they're talking about something where I know that public libraries might have similar programs or be doing the same kind of research, I'll try and find someone also who has a little bit of an outside point of view, still knowledgeable, still an expertise, but can also say, oh, maybe you weren't looking at it with this, you missed something. Recognizing, and I think this really takes advantage of the fact that librarians, we're all multidisciplinary. We all have strengths that sort of transpose and go beyond our basic institutions. But I do think it is important for us to build on one another's expertise. So that is just one of the caveats. I might ask you to review something that doesn't quite seem like what you're an expert on, but or it might be just slightly tangential, but I still think it could be a good viewpoint there. So the mechanics of the peer review process are pretty simple because we are using Scholar Commons sort of software back of the house. So it once a reviewer is selected, it sends out a series of automatic emails and reminders. The editorial board has already sort of picked out how many days we let you know in those emails. I don't have a slideshow to show you of the process because I think it is pretty simple. And if you do come up with questions, you're more than welcome to email me and let me know. I'm here to try and help and to try and make it as easy as possible. I will say that I think it's probably worth saying that SC Libraries, we're trying to be a pretty big tent right now. And so we are going to get submissions, and try and encourage submissions. And some of them might not be quite up to that sort of scientific peer review standard, but I think that the input that the peer reviewers have will just help authors, and if you can approach it from a, help authors have better writing, like develop better writing skills. So towards that end, I don't have a definite rubric for this is what's required in a peer review. And part of that is, if we need to do that at some point, I'd be willing to definitely put together a kind of rubric, but I'd like to experiment for a little while for a few issues to sort of see, just because every paper is different, every paper has strengths and weaknesses. Some papers, if I put out a rubric where that said, I really need you to look at formatting and grammar, but yet most of the critique of the paper is on methodology, then I've sort of wasted your time. And I really want the individual reviewers to be able to come at it and pick up the things that they see are as important. I'm terrible at not giving rubrics to people sometimes for other projects. So, and that's mostly because I kind of want to see what their feedback is anyway, because they might pick up on something that the rubric would neglect. So, but if we need to, we can set one up. So, but I'm always trying to be as available as possible. My email address is on the screen, as is my phone number. That's my office phone at the library, which I get emails about that in case I'm not here. And so I would like to say, I'll just conclude on behalf of the entire SC Libraries editorial board, I'd like to thank Brent and Anna for their participation in this session. And to those of you who have participated, thank you for your time and energies. Whether or not you do peer review for the SC Libraries Journal, it's just great that you could be here today with us, and I hope that you stay safe in these crazy times. And I guess with that, we can open it up for questions, unless Amy had something else on her agenda.
No, I agree with your sentiment. Thank you all so much for devoting your time today. So this is your time as the audience. Any questions that you may have about the peer review process, whether that is for South Carolina libraries or any academic journal, please feel free to go ahead, pop those in the chat, and we will make sure that your questions all get answered.
While people might be crafting questions, Edward, do you mind if I ask you a quick question?
Sure, that's fine, Brent.
Yeah, so this is kind of in relation to what you and Anna had both said about the actual kind of nitty-gritty editing of pieces. So looking for grammar, looking for spelling, that kind of basic stuff. I know when I was editing the journal, I always did kind of a final run through to catch anything that wasn't caught before, but in kind of building on what you had said about possibly not wasting people's time with just sort of the grammatical stuff of the writing. Are you or other editors being assigned each piece as well to kind of be that overseer of each article, or is it still ultimately up to those reviewers?
So yeah, we, in our requirements for articles, we are requiring APA 7, I think it is now. And if it's clear that the author has not met the formatting requirements of APA, then we will also go back and ask them to update maybe their references. If there's other grammatical issues that have not come up in peer review, I mean, the entire editorial board, we divide up the issues between us to go over them, to review them. There is definitely another set of eyes going over every submission before it goes for publication.
Excellent. I had a feeling. I just wanted to make sure, it's just so to give peace of mind in case somebody happened to have that as one of their main hangups.
That's great. Thank you, Brent. And I know some folks feel better as copy editors or as opposed to content, and that's certainly fine if that's what you feel like your natural inclination is. I know I enjoy copy editing probably too much.
Good for you, because I hate it. So.
Although I have to put down the red pen and pick something a little more cheerful.
Yeah, that's why I probably would never agree to work for a non-publisher journal, gasp. Mainly because I can't stand the idea of copy editing. I'm not even sure that I'd be capable of it, to be perfectly honest. You know, correcting somebody's grammar just seems unimaginable.
I think that's
also
go ahead,
yeah.
Anna.
Well, now you also know I was honest when I said that one of the main motivators for me doing this is, you know, getting the first sort of glance at the new ideas in the field.
That's a great point. You're such an ideas person. Getting that sneak peek is something that I never even considered in being a peer reviewer, to be perfectly honest.
Oh, thank you. I'll take that as a compliment.
It is a compliment. That's a big compliment. It's very it's very sneaky of you also.
Well, and if we don't have any questions, you know, the other thing that we could include here would be any tips. If there's anybody else who is, you know, pretty experienced or has written a few peer reviews, if you have any great tips for the crowd, feel free to include those as well. We would love to hear your thoughts.
I would like to say one of the things as a peer reviewer, you know, please don't, when you're doing a peer review, if you're just submitting a document with your comments on it, please don't include your name. We try and have these be anonymous. And I can always go in and take out your name, but it's just one less step for us to do on our end. Don't ever feel like you need to put your name on there, and we prefer them to be anonymous, and they will go on to the authors as anonymous.
Right. Well, it doesn't look like we have any questions. At this time, if you do have any, feel free to follow up with any of us later. I want to go ahead and talk a little bit about our next webinar, which is going to be how to get started in academic publishing. So far we have covered how to write a book review, and we've covered how to write a peer review. But if you actually want to be the person writing that scholarly journal article yourself, you are in luck, because we have a group joining us for the next session on August 13th at 2 p.m. And this webinar is going to focus on the process of writing articles for South Carolina libraries. But it's also going to be helpful for anyone who is an aspiring writer for any journal. I hope that you will all join us. Feel free to register at this link. We'll send out these slides and the recording very soon. If you also have an idea to give a webinar yourself, please let us know. Or if you have feedback about this webinar or any of the webinar series, we have a link for that as well. Thank you all so much for your time today. We really appreciate it. And look at that, we're a little bit early, so I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon. And thanks so much to our presenters as well. That was great.
Thank you. Yeah.